Hello, my name is Chris Brown. I'm a doctoral candidate at North Carolina State University, and I'm here to present our work entitled Understanding the Impact of GitHub Suggested Changes on Recommendations Between Developers. The idea behind this work is that developers are constantly learning from each other and making recommendations to each other, whether it's through processes such as pair programming, code reviews, or an online programming community such as Stack Overflow, social media, and video tutorials and blogs. Software engineers are frequently sharing information and knowledge with each other in their work. This is further motivated by prior work, which explored the methods of tool discovery and what's the most effective way to encourage developers to adopt new development tools. In prior work, Murphy Hill and colleagues explored 7 different modes of tool discovery, including blogs and tutorials or discussion threads, and found that peer interactions or face-to-face interactions between developers learning about new tools was the most effective mode of tool discovery for software engineers. However, even though peer interactions are the most effective mode of tool discovery, they also infrequently occur in the workplace. And this is due to a variety of factors, including developer inertia, where developers are so set in their existing tool set and workflow that they aren't willing to adopt new tools. Murphy Hill also talks about physical isolation, or the remote work of developers as they're isolated in their own environment, makes it harder for them to learn about new tools from their colleagues and coworkers. And then the idea of software engineering becoming a more global practice where development teams are spread out around the world, and it makes it more difficult to communicate and also for tools to be recommended between colleagues. So to study online recommendations, we focus on GitHub. GitHub is a code hosting platform with millions of developers as users and billions of contributions to repositories each year. Prior work has also explored recommendation systems on GitHub, specifically pull requests, which are the primary way developers can make contributions to projects and make recommendations for enhancements or improvements to code, and then also GitHub issues. Bisyande and colleagues found that GitHub issues, even though their primary purpose is for reporting bugs and problems in code, the second most popular reason developers make GitHub issues is to recommend enhancements or to provide feature requests on software. So here we see 2 recommendation systems for developers to make improvements to code on repositories. In October 2018, GitHub released a new feature that allows developers to make recommendations on code, specifically called the suggested changes feature, where reviewers can provide specific and actionable feedback to developers on pull requests in their code. An example can be found here, where as the reviewer, if we're reviewing a pull request, we can click on this new button here that allows us to create a suggested change where we can make a specific recommendation to improve a line of code in a pull request. After we click that button on the line in question, we can write our comment. In this case, we're looking at a line int C, and we're saying, please don't use single character variable names. In Java, you should have more descriptive programming variable names in your code. And the suggested changes feature in this tag here allows us to provide a specific recommendation to improve the code, specifically in this case, changing the line int C to be named int count. And then finally, after the review is submitted, the original developer will see this on their pull request where they have a suggested change and they can see the specific change proposed by the reviewer. And they also have the ability to automatically apply this recommendation using the commit changes button, and it will add this change as a commit to their pull request. Overall, GitHub blog shows that this feature is extremely popular on GitHub. In November 2018, about 2 weeks after the initial public beta release of the feature, the GitHub blog announced since its release, more than 10% of all reviewers suggested at least one suggested change, totaling over 100,000 suggestions, and nearly 4% of all pull request review comments included a use of this feature. Based on these early numbers, we see that developers who use GitHub are quick to adopt suggested changes and make them a natural part of your code review workflow. And again, less than 2 weeks after the initial release of this feature, we see that over 10% of all reviewers made a review with a suggested change and accounted for over 4% of all review comments. Specifically, we're interested in, even though this is a very popular feature, how does it actually impact development practices on GitHub? or how does it impact recommendations between developers as they're developing and maintaining software using the GitHub platform? To examine this, we have 4 research questions. The first examines what types of recommendations developers make. The second is how effective is the suggested changes feature for recommendations. The third is what impact do suggested changes have on the overall outcome of pull requests. And then finally, we looked at how useful suggested changes are between developers. To answer questions, we divided our work into 2 phases. The first phase being an empirical study analyzing the GitHub suggested changes feature, and the second phase collecting feedback from developers on the suggested changes that they received and made on pull requests. So for phase 1, our first research question looked at categories of suggested changes. To do this, we looked at the most recently updated repositories on GitHub, and we randomly sampled 100 suggested changes. To categorize suggested changes, 2 independent researchers examined the code snippet that was suggested in a suggested change, as well as the review comment that was tagged with the suggested change. And we looked at 100 random samples to open code these in our categories for coming up with what types of suggestions and what types of recommendations developers use this feature for. After our analysis, we found 4 different types of suggested changes. The first are non-functional changes, which are changes that don't impact the code, but may be more like a documentation change or fixing a typo. The second are corrective changes, where you're specifically fixing a bug in the code or fixing a problem or issue in the code itself. The third are improvements. So rather than fixing issues in code, you're improving the code, whether it's through refactoring or making more enhancements to improve the performance of the code itself. And then lastly, there are formatting changes. So these are only changes specifically dealing with the style of the code and how the code looks itself. For our second research question, we were interested in how effective is the suggested changes feature. To measure effectiveness, we looked at the most forked repositories on GitHub, and we analyzed over 50,000 pull requests on these popular repositories. To compare the effectiveness of suggested changes, we looked at review comments with code on pull requests. So a quick review on the suggested changes feature. Developers have a specific change here that says change int seed to int count, and they can commit the suggestion automatically. Pull request review comments also allow reviewers to make recommendations using code. However, in this case, there's not the diff format where you can see the specific change, and the developers don't have the automatic ability to apply the recommendation to their code with this commit changes button. So we compared these 2 recommendation systems on GitHub, specifically looking at effectiveness, and we define effectiveness as acceptance and timing. For acceptance, we've specifically looked at recommendation acceptance, or how often the snippet of code in the recommendation comment or suggested change was applied to the actual pull request commit and the preceding commit after this comment was made. And then for contribution acceptance, we looked at the merging of the pull request. So was the pull request overall merged at the end after the recommendations were made? Additionally, we looked at the timing of recommendations, specifically recommendation time, which would be the time for reviewers to make a recommendation on a pull request, the recommendation acceptance time, or how long developers to accept or decide on a recommendation based on the suggested change or the pull request review comment. And then finally, again, the overall contribution time, or the overall length of the pull requests on pull requests with suggested changes compared to those with pull request review comments that contain snippets of code. For our third research question, we were looking at how does this actually impact pull-based software development, which is motivated by prior work looking at the pull-based development model. To do this, we examined the timing, development, and interactions of developers on pull requests using metrics provided by Gusios and colleagues in prior work examining pull requests on GitHub. Our metrics for timing included lifetime and merge time minutes, or the total amount of time of a pull request to be existing, and then also the amount of time for the pull request to be merged. For development and coding activity, we looked at the number of commits The code churn, or the number of lines that are added, modified, or deleted in each commit. And then also the total number of files changed. And then finally, for interactions between developers and collaboration, we looked at commit comments, or the number of review comments on pull requests, issue comments, or the number of discussion comments on the pull request itself, different from review comments. And then finally, the total number of participants in the pull request itself. Our results show that most suggested changes are non-functional or don't impact the code. For RQ2, we found that suggested changes are an effective recommendation system compared to pull request review comments with code. For acceptance, we found that suggested changes were way more popular and way more accepted into repositories than review comments with the code snippet in the comment itself. And then for timing, we found that developers were able to receive recommendations much faster. So reviewers can make recommendations faster with suggested changes, an average of about 4 days. And then the developers can also respond to those suggested changes much faster than the review comments with code. So they respond about 3 days faster. So overall, we see that suggested changes are faster because they allow developers to automatically apply the suggestion to their code, which we'll get into more in our results in our discussion section. For our third research question, we found that suggested changes do significantly increase the time of pull requests, but they provide other benefits to the pull request review process. For example, we see that time significantly increases by a lot, specifically in the lifetime of the pull request itself, and also the time for it to be merged. However, we see that the number of commits and the amount of code changed in commits also significantly increases using suggested changes, and also that there are more developers who participate in the review process by adding review comments, discussion comments, and then also more people participating in the pull request overall. So overall, we say that suggested changes increase coding activity and collaboration between developers. For our second phase, we collected feedback from developers on the suggested changes feature to find out what they liked and disliked about this system. For this, we conducted a survey where we sent a survey to suggestors or reviewers who make a suggested change on a developer's pull request, and also suggestees, or the people who receive a suggested change on their pull request from a reviewer. Overall, we received 39 responses, and our questions were geared toward the usefulness of the system. So how do developers find it useful for both making recommendations and receiving recommendations on their pull requests? In our survey, we included both Likert scale questions asking about the usefulness of this feature, as well as open-ended questions and free response for developers to provide general feedback on their perception of the system and their uses of it in their own work. For our open-ended feedback, we again conducted an open coding technique with 2 independent researchers to develop themes from the feedback that we use to motivate the design of future tools. Overall, for our second phase, we found that developers found the suggested changes feature useful for making recommendations to developers and also for receiving recommendations and improving their code based on pull request feedback. In our qualitative analysis, our open coding provided 8 different themes that we scaled down into 2 main categories: workflow integration and user-driven communication. And I'll define these more in a second. But first, as we review, again, the GitHub suggested changes feature, what is it about this feature that makes it useful for developers who receive a suggested change on their pull request to apply this recommendation more often than a snippet of code by itself or through any other means of making a recommendation to improve the request? So feedback, again, we saw that user-driven communication was a key theme from developers. Specifically here, we see that reviewer 6 praised the GitHub suggested changes feature because it's very convenient to make a suggested change or a recommendation with code instead of formulating it into words. So here we see how the suggested changes feature makes the recommendation with code itself, in this case changing the name of the variable int c to int count, and that makes it much easier for developers to understand the change and understand what they want to be done to improve the pull request, what the reviewer wants done to improve the pull request. Our second theme was workflow integration. So the ability for the suggested changes feature to easily integrate into the existing workflow of developers, which we saw with how popular this feature is and how well adopted it was within the first 2 weeks of the feature being in public beta release. In this case, contributor 4 appreciated that small changes can be applied immediately, and there's a button that fixes it instead of going into your code. So here we see that the ability for suggested changes to automatically be applied into a pull request increases the usability of the tool while not impacting the workflow of developers, having them go back to the code, make the change, and then resubmit the pull request or add the commit manually themselves. And we propose using these two themes, user-driven communication or providing clear and understandable feedback in your recommendations, and workflow integration or being able to integrate easily into the existing workflows of developers to motivate the design of future recommendation systems and tools and improve overall developer behavior in their work. So to wrap up, we believe and propose that by incorporating user-driven communication and focusing on workflow integration in recommender systems, whether it's systems for developers to make recommendations to each other online or automated recommendation systems to automatically make recommendations for different development tools and practices, we believe incorporating these things can improve the effectiveness of the systems to improve the behavior of software engineers in their work. In this specific, we show this by analyzing the GitHub suggested changes feature, a novel feature on GitHub that allows developers to make specific and actionable recommendations for users of the GitHub suggested changes feature. And specifically, we did an empirical analysis of this feature to find that it is an effective system for making recommendations on GitHub. And we also collected feedback from developers who found this feature very useful for making recommendations and also receiving recommendations on their pull requests. Thanks.